I was going through my library looking at cleaning out books, and I stumbled upon The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell by Aldous Huxley. At the time, he was my favorite author. I read everything he ever wrote. I even found obscure articles that he wrote, obscure magazine articles that Huxley wrote on architecture and furniture in English magazines. That's how obsessed I had become with him. In fact, I went to London to research his writings in libraries to find magazine articles he had written. I thought he was one of the greatest minds of all time. I mean, I've since altered it because, guys 18, 20, 21 years old fall in love with people mentally, intellectually, and they idolize them until eventually, things emerge, they change, they become different. But I'm going to read to you from this, for me, a few reasons, The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell from Huxley, later on to show you how things have not really changed. When he goes on and on about tobacco and alcohol and drugs and why people use them. You know that I stopped watching Fox, MSNBC, and CNN? I click it on, I turn it off, I can't take it. I won't watch it. It agitates me, it gets me angry, I won't watch it. I just won't watch it. I don't want to see the lies and the propaganda. I can't stand it. So, I don't know, to each his own. It's a big world with a lot of options, that's all. So to go back to something that may please you, The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell by Aldous Huxley, which is an important book for us today in America because Huxley was one of the first Western writers to experiment with consciousness-expanding drugs. And in these two short essays, he was describing the mescaline-inspired visionary landscapes of the mind, visions of heavenly delights, which could in the wrong hands be transformed into a schizophrenic hell. And he was one of the century's finest minds, and he sampled the mescaline experience. Now, I want to read you what he had to say about alcohol and tobacco, how horrible they were, and why people constantly looked. Well, let me read it to you instead of paraphrasing. We now spend a good deal more on drink and smoke than we spend on education. This, of course, is not surprising. The urge to escape from selfhood and the environment is in almost everyone, almost all the time. And that was, I underlined it. I found it underlined with a pen. But the need for frequent chemical vacations from intolerable selfhood and repulsive surroundings will undoubtedly remain. That was interesting. Ours is the age, among other things, of the automobile and of rocketing population. Alcohol is incompatible with safety on the roads, and its production, like that of tobacco, condemns to virtual sterility many millions of acres of the most fertile soil. The problems raised by alcohol and tobacco cannot, it goes without saying, be solved by prohibition. Cannot be solved by prohibition. The universal and ever-present urge to self-transcendence is not to be abolished by slamming the currently popular doors in the wall. The only reasonable policy is to open other, better doors in the hope of inducing men and women to exchange their old bad habits for new and less harmful ones. Some of these other, better doors will be social and technological in nature. Others, religious or psychological. Others, dietetic, educational, athletic. But the need for frequent chemical vacations from intolerable selfhood and repulsive surroundings will undoubtedly remain. What is needed is a new drug which will relieve and console our suffering species without doing more harm in the long run than it does good in the short. Such a drug, he wrote, must be potent in minute doses and synthesizable. If it does not possess these qualities, its production, like that of wine, beer, spirits, and tobacco, will interfere with the raising of indispensable food and fibers. It must be less toxic than opium or cocaine, less likely to produce undesirable social consequences than alcohol or the barbiturates, less inimical to heart and lungs than the tars and nicotine of cigarettes. And on the positive side, it should produce changes in consciousness more interesting, more intricately, no, I think he meant intrinsically. Yes, it's a typo. More intrinsically valuable than mere sedation or dreaminess, delusions of omnipotence, or release from inhibition. Then he goes to the next phase. To most people, mescaline is almost completely innocuous. Unlike alcohol, it does not draw. And he goes into a whole story of how wonderful mescaline was. Now, he was wrong. And I'll tell you how I know he was wrong. Because years later, this book was written before my time. It was written, it was very popular in the 60s. It was published in 1954 in England. republished many, many times. Became a big hit amongst the drug people, drug users in the in the 60s. Everyone quoted William Blake with the long hair and the hippie earring and said, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything will appear to man as it is infinite." No one knew what it meant, but they quoted the line with a sparkle in their eye, and they figured they'd get lucky that night with some willing, dumb lady walking around who didn't know what he was talking about. Doors of perception. What is she? Schmen. Doors of perception. But people were quoting stuff like that. Shortly after 67, 65, 66, I drove out to Los Angeles from New York City. Actually, I flew out. I drove back in a little Nash car with the heater on all the way. I didn't know. I thought the engine was... I visited Archera Huxley. I was such a fan. He had died, and I visited his widow, Laura Huxley, and she told me that he was wrong about mescaline. And I'll tell you when she told me that. I will tell you under what circumstances she learned that he said he was wrong. This has never before been disclosed anywhere. Not in literature, not in the popular press. I'll tell it to you when I return right here, because I'm going to reward you for listening to this show in a moment. It's madness. The whole thing is madness. Everything is backwards and upside down. New York nears law tightening limits on guns. Perry Como vowing passage. Bills would be among the most restrictive in the nation. Of course it will be the most restrictive. What do you expect from a radical leftist like Perry Como's grandfather, Mr. Cuomo? You expect him to be liberal? Would you ever expect a liberal to be liberal? You don't expect a liberal to be liberal. You expect a liberal to be restrictive. You see, you can't put two and two together then. The conservative is liberal and the liberal is restrictive. But that takes a little while to think that through. So, because so many people are drugged, they don't understand it. So that's why I was reading from The Doors of Perception, Heaven and Hell by Aldous Huxley, where he was arguing for mescaline as an alternative to the labyrinth of alcohol and tobacco. And then I told you that years after the book was published, after he died rather, I went to L.A., I got an audience with his then widow. His widow was still living, Laura Archera Huxley. Lovely lady. She was on top of a mountain, Mulholland Drive, Los Angeles. To me, a kid from New York, when I first drove on Mulholland Drive, I did think it was paradise itself, because I remember meeting the boy Juan, the Mexican boy who was like the pool kid that Huxley wrote about. I was shocked. There he was in person. And there was the swimming pool that Huxley wrote about, the literal paradise on earth. Of course, today Mulholland Drive is a different story for me. You know, I've gone there so many times. I go to a certain deli off Mulholland Drive, a certain Italian restaurant. I've met some actors there that we've had lunch and dinner together. I think I've told you about it. But anyway, so I visited Laura Huxley. I was this starry-eyed, 20-year-old. I don't know how old I was. What did he say? What did he do? Da-da-da. Mescaline, is it really that great? Does it really open the doors of perception? Well, she said, Michael, she said, here's something I must tell you. We've had a seance. I've talked to Aldous from the next world, and he said, tell people that I was wrong. Mescaline is not the agent that I thought it was. I was wrong about it. That's what she told me. I don't think I've ever really disclosed the story, and I think it's an important story for historians who may pick up on this, or they could dismiss it as not important because it came from me. After all, I only have a Ph.D. and 2 master's degrees, and I've only written 28 books and traveled most of the world and lived in very interesting places and done folk research and whatnot. Why should they listen to me? They should listen instead to somebody on CNN, perhaps a sex change artist from Syria would be somebody that would be more important. But nevertheless, without being facetiously idiotic, it's a historically interesting point in this age of drugs and the overusage of drugs, which is that mescaline was completely misinterpreted by the drug generation, and there is no doors of perception that are cleansed by LSD and or mescaline at all. All you got to do is look at the streets of Berkeley and the halls of Washington, D.C. to understand what LSD does to people. All you got to do is look at the halls of Congress and take a look at the people that Obama has surrounded himself with to see what happens 30 years after the doors of perception are cleansed by mescaline and LSD. Take a look at what's happened. Everything is upside down. The world is upside down. That's why it goes back to what I said earlier. every politician should have a background check and a drug test. There should be a requirement that every politician that we post on the internet, they post their urine analysis. You have to do it if you go to work for a company, don't you? But there's much more at stake with someone deciding budgets and wars and peace, and we don't know what drugs they're on. We have no idea how stoned they may be on prescription drugs, for example. Doesn't it explain, isn't it possible that that's why they do such foolish and insane things? That they're cracked out of their mind? Or they're just on too many psychoactive compounds to begin with? I believe every politician should have a background check and should have a drug test that's posted on the internet before they run for office. You know? Anyway, it's one man's opinion. Take a look at who they're appointing now to run the CIA. Did you hear that soundbite last night? I was shocked. I don't know how this man could get confirmed. I don't know what kind of country I'm living in. Islam helped to shape the CIA nominee John Brennan's worldview. He traveled to Indonesia with an earring and long hair, with a flower in his hair. And he came back telling us how great Islam is, the goodness and beauty of Islam. Is this guy out of his mind? Of course there are nice Muslims. And what, America's not filled with beautiful people, only Islam is? Christianity has no beautiful people.